Hi, welcome everybody to NASCAD Artwork Alumni Talks. While our NASCAD community is a global one, our school and therefore our talk today is hosted in Chibuktuk, Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. We're honored to gather, speak, and make artwork here. My name is Molly Cronin, and I am the host of Artwork. Each month, I get the opportunity to speak to two of our alum and discuss where their career and art practice have taken them since their time at the school. And this week, I'm excited to talk to Nam Nguyen, who was an MFA of 2008, and Pam Juarez, BFA 2021. And we're going to be talking about color and color science. So thank you, Nam and Pam, for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd love to start off with talking about both of your times at NASCAD. Maybe Pam, we'll start with you because you're a fairly recent graduate. Could you tell us a little bit about your time at NASCAD and who you were working with and what you were interested in at the time?
Yeah, so I started going, I think I started into 2017, and it was just kind of like a really rash decision to go to art school. And I did not plan to stay there for a long time, but here I am. And I went with like the goal of getting a degree in textiles and fashion. Um, and I did that. And I work mostly with the fact like the textile department with Jenny Green and Elena Brevenel. But I also did a lot of community work with the Art Factory and Lisa Hamilton. So I think that was my time at NASCAD. I was like doing a lot of like mostly print, a little bit of weaving, but mostly print with Elena. And outside classes, I was working with Lisa Hamilton and bringing textile education to community groups.
Oh, that's great. Nam, what about you? What was your time at NASCAD like?
I was very young. I did my master's there when I was 23. Seems like a long time ago now, in 2005, I believe, to 2006 to 2008, I think. Um, and I was really excited to just really get a lot of studio time. And I was just exploring a lot of ideas. So I just kind of got there and hit the ground running and started working as hard as I could and just producing a lot. And I look back now to the experience, and I think that um, everything there was so much feedback and so much dialogue that um, I didn't process it basically right away. And now I look back and I think about a lot of the different people who gave me feedback and engaged with my work back then. And so yeah, I really loved it. I also got really lucky with my studio, so I got this kind of enclosed studio up in the top floor of I don't know which building you call it. Yeah, one of the old buildings.
Hmm.
It was great. I had a lot of space, and since everything was kind of like um, so close together, I could literally go to class, go to my studio, go home. I lived close by, and I kind of had this strange 2 years of like being a weird studio bum. Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
That's great. Can you tell us a little bit about your practice now, where you're based, and the kind of work that you're doing?
Yeah, I'm based in Berlin, and so I got here not so long after I left NASCAD actually, because I received the Joseph Plaskett Foundation Award. And back then it was kind of a no-brainer. Like I personally had no idea what Berlin was. And anybody asked, they were just like, oh, just go to Berlin. So I went to Berlin and used it as a kind of base of operations, I guess. And yeah, I just traveled around. My research, what I wrote for and applied for, was to really study historical painting.
Hmm.
Um, and so I did that, and it really completely changed how I thought about painting. So it was kind of a funny moment because I had finished grad school, and then I felt that I needed to rework everything that I had learned based on what I saw. Um, and so, yeah, that led to an interest in craft, but I didn't really understand it at that moment. So yeah, fast forward, what is it? How long has it been? 15, 13 years later. And now I am fully invested in the craft of painting, in the sense that I'm making my own paint, oil paint, but more recently I've been making my own gesso, and infusing it with pigment, and using it as a type of paint as well, which has been fascinating. So I'm just in the middle of that right now. Yeah.
That's great. And we're going to talk a lot about that process today and about the kind of science behind the paint you use and make and colors, etc. So I'm yeah, excited to chat more about that. But Pam, can you tell us a bit about your practice these days, or the work you're doing these days?
Yeah, so right after I graduated NASCAD during COVID, so it was very strange to kind of navigate my practice right after graduation. So I kind of just put it on the side and waited to figure out what I was going to do during a pandemic as a recent grad. So I kind of picked up that community work that I was doing with Lisa Hamilton and started a position at the McPhee Center and got into arts administration. And kind of prioritize that career over my practice for a bit. But recently I moved to like a part-time position with Craft Nova Scotia. So I'm still doing craft admin, but I have like the one day that I get to dedicate to my studio practice. And luckily I found a really sweet spot. I should mention that I'm still based in Chipuktuk. It's been 3 years since I graduated. And I found a really sweet spot at Collaborative Studio North. It's a really sweet communal studio in the north end on Camp Road. And I have my studio there with 12-ish other artists. And most of them are craft based. So that's kind of like the environment that I really, really needed to kind of like motivate me to create more, to like have conversations with artists on a regular basis. Because I think after graduation, I was really missing that aspect of NASCAD, like being able to form connections with the people that are creating around you was so important to me. And yeah, when I graduated from NASCAD, I thought I was going to be dyeing and printing and like, focusing on that. But I've been, I struggle, like I've been kind of figuring out how to set up my studio so that I can create. And that is something that I'm still kind of figuring out. Equipment is expensive, space is limited, and a lot of the like craft media that I learned requires so much of that. So like these 3 years have been like, how do I fit my practice in with a part-time job, and how do I create the space and like gather the resources that I need to practice? So yeah, I've been kind of I'm still in the works. I'm still trying to find like a constant, a comfortable pace. And recently I've been also wanting to not move away from textiles. I think I reach a limit that I need to learn something new. And I've been picking skills in jewelry. So yeah, I've been trying to learn more from crafts and see how I can like put them all together to help my work. But yeah, still dyeing and weaving mostly. And yeah, we'll talk more about my dyeing process and colors in a couple of questions.
Yeah. It's really interesting to hear from both of you about the kind of like unlearning and rebuilding that happens after school and as you start to build a studio and community where you're working. Um, is there anything in particular you found that you took from NASCAD in either kind of like that process or in your current practice, Pam?
So I kind of mentioned that if it wasn't for NASCAD, I don't think I would be practicing. I initially like I have I have a degree that I did before NASCAD in anthropology, archaeology, and geography, and I thought I was going to continue that academically. But then I just met a couple of people that like got to know me creatively, and they said like, "Hey, I know that you have another plan, but maybe this is for you." And I was like in a transition period, so I gave it a go. And I just continued doing it. So yeah, like it's hard for me to kind of distinguish what NASCAD gave my practice, because like it is how I started practicing. Um, but yeah, I haven't had a lot of time to digest that, I
Yeah.
think. I haven't made those connections. It's been 3 years. It's been wild 3 years with the pandemic.
Mhm.
But I definitely have been nourishing the connections that I've made at NASCAD, and that has been so helpful in, keeping the practice alive. It's hard. It's hard, right?
Yeah, it takes a village to
Mm.
do any
Yeah.
of it, right? Yeah. No, that's amazing. Community is a huge, huge part of this kind of work that we're doing. So thank you, Pam. Nam, what about you? Was there anything in particular from your time at NASCAD that you think you've brought with you into your practice now?
Oh yeah, definitely. Like NASCAD's great in the sense of like how different each perspective is, like in terms of all the faculty I worked with. I think everybody had their own thing going on, and they really approached my work quite differently with their own perspective. And at some point, I definitely got confused, and I stayed confused, and I think that's okay. I think what NASCAD gave me really was the fact that it's kind of like that's just kind of the deal. Like that's kind of like the process that you're really kind of like grasping after trying to stabilize something, but it really just kind of slips away from you. And I think that's kind of over time I kind of realized that that was an appropriate thing. I think I had a lot of frustration for about 10 plus years, maybe more. And I'm starting to be okay with the fact that I think that if you're kind of pursuing something and exploring something, things will change. Uh, and it's most of the time, and especially I think for me at NASCAD, because I was such a maker, that these things don't, the kind of cognitive understanding of something doesn't really happen until later, I think, for me. And that's kind of the norm for me. So I've kind of learned to spend some more time reflecting about what I've done. But to be honest, it's not the easiest or thing to do, or the thing that I like to do, because I kind of like to get lost in process, I guess, or work artwork. And yeah, I think that like the other thing that I definitely got out of NASCAD was this kind of passion for getting into the library and just researching and finding your own solutions, which I think generally everybody was kind of encouraging me to do. And yeah, and they were doing it themselves, and it was interesting to kind of see how our ideas interacted. They definitely were role models for me. Even though I think a lot of it was maybe not so useful, it was interesting to hear, for example, Matthew Reichertz at the time was very interested in the politics of abstract and modern painting. For whatever reason, for I think in his own work, and he definitely gave me a few articles that changed my way of thinking about that period of time.
Well, I'd love to bring it back to you mentioned process, and I think for both of you, um, process and the way you're thinking through materials is a big part of this work. And Pam, your kind of cross disciplined craft approach right now, or this kind of exploration you're doing. And Nam, you're talking about painting as a craft, right? You're thinking very much about the kind of like history and ways of making in painting. So I'd love to talk to you both a bit about the processes you're working with. Nam, you talked about kind of creating gesso and creating pigments. Can you talk a bit more about that process, to use the word one more time, and kind of how you got into developing these materials?
Um, I like I think that my interest in the craft aspect of painting has always been there. And then when I went to Europe and saw a lot of painting, historical painting, it really sparked the interest, or like lit a fire even more. And I was really fascinated with these paintings, like the visual effects, like mostly Baroque painting, era painting, like Claude de Lorraine, which is a landscape painter, or um, Esteban Morello, I think his name is Bartolomeo Esteban Morello, a very unknown painter in the world, but very famous in Spain during that time, who painted these kind of heaven scenes, and in the end with like the Madonna, and I was just like, oh, when I was like quite taken aback. I'm not really into the symbols, and I definitely respect where it came from, the context of their religion and everything, but I was just fascinated by how he painted the clouds of heaven, and that somehow I really felt something spiritual, and I'm not necessarily a religious or spiritual person in that way, but I was looking at it and I was like, okay, like through his craft, through his technique, there's some sort of energy that's being conveyed here visually. So I kind of tried to bring those ways of layering into my practice, in a body of work that was a kind of exploring like photography and my identity and architecture. And I wanted to infuse it into the work. And the work was successful, more or less. It took about 5 years of trial and error, but the technical, the craft side really did not succeed to the level that I was looking for. And I got really frustrated, and I became kind of obsessed with this failure, and I had a crisis. And so I had this moment where I was just like painting things like one color, just like I'm almost kind of just like a miserable monochrome like period. um and then one day I had a eureka moment, and what it was is like I painted a painting with the color brown, like this like burnt umber, and it had a similar energy that I was looking for, and I was just like why would that be? So I started doing some research about like color quality, and turns out that because it's so cheap that the paint companies just don't put very much filler in it. They just like it's like dirt, so they just make the paint pure and sell it. And then I was like, oh, okay, so that means I have to make my own paint. And then and then the eureka moment definitely did happen. I was like, oh, it's like the painting I'm interested in is pre-industrial. So they were making their paint, and they were craftspeople of making color as well. And so that started the whole chain of making paint. And it was a very, I'd have to say, like difficult journey. Yeah.
Yeah, lots of trials and errors, I imagine, in learning how to make your own
Yeah, I mean,
materials
like,
that way.
yeah, it's exciting. It's both exciting because you get some quick results, of course, but but it's that painful. It's like I was like around. I think I was like my mid 30s or early 30s, and you really hope to get past the awkward phase of learning in art, and then and then it just like by pursuing that, you just go back to being like adolescent of painting again, like of like, oh, this is exciting, and I'm making lots of mistakes, or I don't know why this is happening, and having this kind of like swell of emotions and confusion all over again, and struggling to get some amount of control. Yes, but it was very humbling.
Pam, what about you? What was the process like for you in kind of reaching the relationship to materials that you do? Like, how did you come to kind of work through creating the dyes and et cetera that you are working with now?
So for me, it was like, I'm a Mexican immigrant. I grew up in Mexico. I think that's really important to say. And I have a deep connection with color, the colors that I use, because I grew up with them. So for me, when I started learning more about textiles, and there is this tendency in craft that you just kind of want to, it's like, it's not enough to weave your own fabric. You also have to like dye the yarn. Oh, and it's not enough to do that. You also have to do this. And then you just kind of just work backward.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's just me, but like if it's a crafters thing. So, like it's always kind of researching about like traditions that I'm like really close to, and learning about the natural dyes that have been used have been used in Mexico to dye traditional clothing. So yeah, like I think that was kind of part of it. Part of it is also like being in NASCAD and giving assignments that otherwise I wouldn't be giving myself. So I still remember the first time in dye class in print and dye that we had to like color match using the pigments that we were using, like dyes. And there was something about like this reverse engineering that it really clicked with me. So like it's this process that I was like, oh, color is so cool because it's not just like you mix two together, it's trial and error. It's like really getting to know something deeply. So it's just kind of like this reverse engineering that comes with color that I think is really interesting to me, and also like this cultural background that all the colors have because they don't exist in a void. They have like so much context. I previously said that I have a background in archaeology, and you start digging about the Silk Roads and how pigments travel and how natural dyes are used. You just like, I don't know, it's just kind of like you can't see color like just a color anymore. Like you need to be aware of all the context. You need to learn about the colonial history of color and how it's spread through imperialism. So yeah, that's like I completely forgot the question, but like that is how I got into color, is just kind of like learning, investigating and reverse engineering, and just kind of like with natural dyes forming a relationship with it through trial and error.
And what kind of natural dyes are you making these days? Are you foraging here, like there in
So
Chibuktuk, or what's the
I
process like?
don't forage in Chibuktuk. I mostly focus on three different dyes, and that is marigold, cochineal, and indigo. So those are three dyes that I use because they're traditionally used in Mexico too. And I spent over, 4 years working with these dyes and experimenting and seeing what I can do with them and learning about the rich history. So I don't forage just because it's all about relationship building with
Mhm.
me. I will eventually form relationships with the dyes here and learn about their histories, but I feel like those might not be my histories to tell.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I want to like I'm being deeply personal in the dyes that I pursue.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Pam. Um, I love the conversation about color, and I want to shift it to you, Nam, as well, and talk about color in your work. We've talked about the kind of like development of color and some of the color that's inspired you, but can you tell us a bit more about the kind of use of color in your work, the kind of uh, if you're trying to kind of still replicate that kind of luminosity you saw in those historical paintings, or how your relationship to color has changed now that you're making your own pigments, or what is the yeah, what is the tell us more about the relationship to color in your work. Sorry, that's a very long-winded question.
Yeah, I think like color, color is a super important part of my work. On the material level, like working with pigments, it definitely I discovered the color as a material actually for the first time. Like I think that there's something divorced about materiality, and when somebody prepares the paint for you, you don't have to actually deal with the material, so you don't have appreciation for what it actually is. And so when I started making my own paint, I quickly discovered that the companies really had all these secret recipes that made their brand. They would make, they'd have a similar texture for each paint, which I'm still kind of exploring. And of course, it's not food, so there's no ingredients. And so I started making my own paint, and it doesn't really work for every pigment because you do need to add some stabilizing stone dust like calcium carbonate or marble dust, which I, through scrolling the internet and research on my own, like I discovered that that was exactly the same thing that the pre-industrial painters of that time also did. Like Velasquez used the, the pigment dolomite. And so I got really into, and then as I was doing that, I got really into like, I don't think I was like interested in color as in like bright, lots of color, like every color on the rainbow or color beside color. I was more, what brought me into getting into pigments was like saturation or like energy, where I would look at painting, and that, you know, those paintings in that time weren't that colorful in the sense of like lots of color, because they were limited to what they could source from the earth. It was like an organic time, so they, you know, it was like, so I mean, of course there was some from mining, earth, the lead whites, which was made in funny ways, which I couldn't explain to you really. Um, but they had a limited palette basically. But because they could make it themselves, they could load up the paint with enough energy to kind of create the energy field that I was seeing. And with that, they also needed to like, I really love like the nuance, like how much subtlety and richness that you could get out of one or two colors. And so that was really what attracted me to the work with pigments. And so like now I'm very similar to that. Like I don't use a lot of colors. I'm more interested in like getting as much out as I can out of certain colors. So one of the colors I'm really was really working with um, in the past 5 years is this ultramarine blue. But once I got into sourcing the pigments from this company called Kramer's, there's about like 10 versions. So there's, and they produce it chemically, right? So I'm not exactly sure how they do it. It might be heating, or it might be in the formation of the solution or something like that. But like so they can make like a ultramarine blue light. They can make an ultramarine blue very light. I mean, going back to what Pam was saying, it's like it'd be, you know, like it's fascinating to know about this, and I would wonder if I can get into a lab and start making my own like adjustments to the color on that level. Yeah, so like having said that, there's that like just the variance in the pigment, and now what I'm, and with that, like the other part of the equation that really inspired me was layering. And I think layering has always been a part of my work. It's like a basic part of painting. And but I really was always fascinated how by what layering could do um, to generate like a complex color. Because like, so I'd be like, in the past I would make a very fluorescent underpainting and paint in pastel gel on top or something like that, and get a color breathing, and that's what I was doing in grad school. um, and it's still there's so those same concerns still seem to be here with my work today, because it's this kind of slippery, unpredictable nature of like layering paint and seeing how the the different colors on top of each other kind of behave to create new colors. And so it becomes like, so it's like, but those colors don't really exist in reproduction, or they don't really exist in um as like, you couldn't you it's like color theory usually has like, you know, that they have like clear colors and they show interaction of the colors. It's like orange, blue, that does something. But when it's like the orange is over the blue, or orange over a blue white, your eye is creating the color through the bounce of the light, and so it can change drastically, depending on the lighting situation, depending on how you're feeling, and as, or even by just simply walking across from one side of the painting to the other. And so that like that moment when the light is passing through these layers and coming out and hitting your eye, there's like, it's like an event, you know, it's like, it's really like a moment. And that's kind of like the color I'm more interested in, because it's a, for me, color is about like destabilizing perception a bit, or like, or pushing perception, so that we're maybe like not, we kind of drop our cognitive way of thinking for just, you know, a brief moment.
Yeah, you describe it as cultivating like a, I think you wrote a altered chromatic experience, or creating that experience for the viewer. Can you talk a bit about that idea of kind of the work being viewed in person, and the kind of experience you're hoping to cultivate?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's like the colors. People love color, you know. Like people will go like be like, oh, color, you know, and that's definitely the first step. Like, and that's like an easy win, you know. It's like you make a rich color, people are like, oh, I'm into it. And but I hope that, you know, with there's like kind of optical things that happen the longer you look at the color. And this has to do with their eyes. I couldn't explain it to you because I don't know the actual physiology of it, but you kind of, as you're looking at it, the painting starts to change and shift. You kind of get, I find like I'm looking at the painting, and so I use like a lot of like, right now I'm using a lot of framing devices. And when the painting is working, as the painting is working, it starts to like wobble. Like when you're looking at the colors are so intense that your eye has trouble kind of like keeping things in order. And then so like as you scan, and as you scan, the painting starts to shift. And I was like talking to a friend of mine who was once a neuroscientist. He's not anymore. He moved on to medicine, but he did these experiments that prove that like basically as our eye scans, there's nothing between each scan point. And so our perception is like created mostly through the mind and not through perception, actually. So we're kind of like taking a lot of shortcuts. But I find that like when you're working as a visual artist and you're looking all the time, you really start noticing this, and I think for the most part, this is a very disturbing feeling. Like I think that for myself, like, I'm looking at my own painting. I literally put the paint on myself. Why does it look this way today, and why did it look that way tomorrow? Was it an emotional thing? Or then you start kind of like, as you start getting into it, you start really like realizing, I think in a positive way, how rich like even 1 square meter of space can be, and how rich the world is, like, and how rich perception is. And for me, like, I would like the viewer to own a painting, not because I want to sell. Of course, I want to sell, but I want them to have it in their home so they can see under changing light conditions, which I find really important. And somehow in these moments when I'm looking at the painting, it kind of slows down time, where I'm like, oh, you kind of become aware of the changing of time and how that changes our perception of reality. I mean, these are like, sounds like a lot, but usually like it could happen. Like when it's happened to me with my own artwork, it happens and it's like 5 seconds or something.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. The kind of like that color, our relationship to color can be this kind of experiential thing, or this like lived with thing. I think that makes, and that it changes all the time. I think that makes perfect sense. Yeah. Pam, what about you? Is there a kind of relationship to color you're hoping to cultivate in showing the work, or is there another relationship kind of to materials or processes that you're thinking about when the work is being shown in Chibuktuk or elsewhere?
Yeah, so I also like Nam, I want the viewer to think about process. I think there is a lot of invisible labor that in art just generally, but also in craft, that it is a lot of work to finish a product. So a part of my work, I kind of want to bring the process to the forefront instead of it just being like an outcome. So recently I've been focusing, I named the 3 dyes that I've been working with in the past couple of months. I've been, learning a lot and doing kind of like a survey of cochineal, which is a super cool dye that it's a bug, and the bug is a pest on cacti, like those flat cacti that I call nopal. I don't know if they have a name in English. But it's just like really significant because it brings all these rich colors that are associated with Mexican cultures. And the nopal as a plant where they grow is also very significant in like origin myths, and we eat it and we do a lot of things with it. So for me, it's really important to tell that story. But I also been, as I'm trying to deepen my relationship with this plant and the bug, I'm also learning that the nopal and cochineal are symbols of Palestinian resistance. And then it's my responsibility to put that in the work as well. So cochineal is also used in Palestinian garments, in tattoos, and there is very incredible history of the nopal that they call sabar, and that means patience. It's a very, very hardy plant, and it lives, for ages. And there are cacti in occupied territories that tell the history of occupation and the violence of occupation. One story that stays with me all the time is that Palestinians used to outline their territory, like their houses, their plots, using this plant. And after the Nakba of like 1948, the towns are not there, but the cacti are still there. So it's a really, really important plant. It's an important dye, and I want the viewers to know these stories, because it's not just about color, it's just about people. And specifically now that we are witnessing a genocide, it's very important to talk about the resistance.
Thanks, Pam. I'm going to turn it over to questions in a minute, but I want to kind of conclude our section here, maybe asking you both if you had advice for students as they're kind of developing their practice. Pam, we're talking a lot about the kind of important weight of color and of practices. And do you have any advice for incoming students who are interested in these conversations, in these kind of cross resistance conversations, or just kind of like understanding the significance of color in their work?
Yeah,
In
I would say,
textiles?
um, Nama, you were talking about the awkwardness of learning. Get over that. Like, I don't know how to say it. It's just like learning is so important. Continuous learning is so important. Failing is so important, especially when working with color and examining color. I think the way that both of us are doing it, there's going to be failure the entire time. I still fail on a regular basis when I'm like investigating a dye. So it's just like getting comfortable with failure and knowing that that's part of the process, right? Like you can't expect to learn out of nowhere. And especially if you are seeing color as like a science, because I think we both use the scientific method to work with color. We do our research, we do like trial tests, we fail, we create new knowledge through that process. Is yeah, like be patient. Learn to embrace that awkwardness of failing and learning and not knowing what you're doing. Because eventually you will form relationships with your materials that are really precious.
And to that idea of the awkwardness, Sarah Hartland Rowe said the same thing in the chat, that awkwardness never really goes away. And maybe in fact for her, she's saying that it actually increased the longer that she works. And that often like a new painting is always feels a bit like the first time. So I think that's I like that. Check that out in the chat, everybody. But Nam, I'll turn the question to you as well. Does this kind of like conversation around awkwardness still ring true, or are there other words of advice you would give to incoming graduates of NASCAD who are looking to get into working the way you're working?
Yeah, this is like, it's like a long evolution. It's like, I'm not the most patient person, like, so I would have to say I was quite frustrated for a very long time. Um, and I got kind of made it like not fun for a certain period. Um, I mean, I think that like it's not like I'm telling everybody just to have fun, or is this so simple to have fun? But I think that like at some point I realized that to make things sustainable and for myself psychologically and personally, I had to have something that was I had to know that when I went to the studio, it wouldn't just be a grind, because sometimes for knowledge acquisition and for learning, there's no way around it. You have to grind. And like, for example, you know, like I had to store all of the paints. I have to like label all the paints. The grinding itself is not that much fun, you know, like it's really just like a tedious process. Um, and I think that like once I kind of figured that out, that for me, I don't know what that is necessarily any given day, but like for me, if I have to try to remind myself that there's like what are the nourishing parts of the process, and it can be as simple as just seeing what the color looks like and having a little bit of delight, you know. But whatever that is for the artist, I can't say. But yeah, I think thinking about how it makes things sustainable is really important, because definitely you strange, like logic is a strange thing. Like you to do if you logic can tell you to do something you don't want to do, basically, until your body says no. And then you just stop, right? Because you're just like, what am I doing? Like, this is this is coming from myself, but also from um talking to my colleagues, and just talking to lots of people who have also given up. And not that's a bad thing, but at some point they just felt that whatever was there wasn't sustaining them anymore, and they had changed their priorities, which is perfectly fine. It's just something to be aware of as you get out of art school and have to, you know, juggle your art practice with a lot of normal responsibilities.
Yeah, and one of the questions I often ask alum in these interviews is, it's like a kind of twofold question. I ask them like to either tell me about their practice or about, or like their kind of current like projects that are coming up, or about how they're cultivating rest. Because I think often the question of like, what are you working on right now, is this kind of there's a little bit of a pressure point to it, but also it implies that artists are having to kind of always be hustling, and like burnout culture is so real in the arts. So I really always like to hear a bit about how artists are finding those moments of like rest or ease in their practice. So it's really nice to hear the ways you're thinking through that in just like your studio practice, Nam. So thanks for sharing that. Actually, to that point, before we have another minute before we turn to questions. Pam, similar question. Is there ways that you try to cultivate rest or kind of replenishment in your practice?
So I mentioned before that it's really important for me to be in collaborative spaces, collaborative creative spaces. And I think, I mean, there's so many ways that I incorporate rest into my practice, but one of them is, again, fun. And, you know, just kind of reminding myself, like, I chose to do this because I actually enjoy it. Like, this is what I want to do. And one of the perks of like being in a collaborative studio is that I can practice creativity as part of my practice or as part of fun. And I sometimes forget that like, oh, I can do art for fun. So I've been trying to just create with friends and have constant craft nights that don't have to be fruitful or don't have to be part of my practice, collage nights and paper mache and stuff like that. But also, I don't know, I think as creative people that take something that we're really passionate about into something that is part of our careers, that can be like a big shock. Uh, Kind of discovering that, you know, once you kind of like make that your career, it is no longer, you don't no longer have access to it as part of like nourishment for you. Like it's complicated. Everybody has a different relationship with it. So I make sure that I practice other creative paths, like find something else that is creative, that fulfills that creativity for the sake of having fun, for the sake of creativity. So I've been dancing, and it's kind of like part of my res. Like I take dance classes, where, you know, like a creative outlet that is, you know, there's no consequences to it.
I love that. I hope you get lots of dancing in the next while. Okay, well, thank you guys so much. We're going to open it up to questions now. So if you have any questions for Pam or Nam, please either turn your camera on and ask directly, or pop it in the chat and I'll read it out loud. Erin, go ahead.
Hello. So this is a question for both of you. You both talked a lot about just having a lot of interest in making your own colors. So whether it's with pigments for paint, or if you're creating dyes using natural dyes. And something that I've noticed among my fellow artists, but also students who I see in my studio classes in particular, there is this real desire to collect and to be involved in the process of making the actual materials that you're working with, whether it be paint or inks or dyes. And I know, just for example, like at NASCAD, the natural dye classes are always super popular. And so I'm just curious if both of you might have thoughts on why that might be, and why there is kind of a growing interest in people making their own materials to work with.
Like in our society, I think that like we're very used to like going to a restaurant and having somebody cook for us, or going, like for me, like painting, like I know I was like a paint nerd, so I was like, oh, I'll buy the best brand, or I'll buy this cheap brand that's good for impasto. There's a limit to that, like in terms of how interesting that can be. Like, or it's like funny, you watch a movie that's like made from Hollywood, and it's like it's good, like it's really well done, but there's something kind of like touching about somebody trying to make their own movie on their phone and then showing it to friends. Like I think that's what the draw is, like that it's so strange, but basically like engagement with our world has become exotic. Like actually like looking at dirt on the ground is like wild or something. And I think that's part of it. And I think with what Pam was saying about her materials and the stories that they can have, and as you get into it, it's like, oh, it's like, wait a minute, it's always been there, and there's lots of interesting things about it, and it's really exciting actually. And I think that's definitely my path of like discovering pigments and their stories, that are world stories. Like like for example, I went on vacation to Greece with my wife and her family. And we went to Crete, and we discovered Minoan. Like I discovered Minoan painting and fresco. Guess what? They used the rocks around them. It was like, okay, there's ochre columns, very beautifully painted red columns. That really, was like a beautiful architectural element. And then and at the same time, I had read this book by Victoria Finlay. I think it was called Inside the Color Box or something. I don't know, but she talks about ochre in Australian Aboriginal use, which I don't know a lot about. Obviously, it's just an anecdote, but I was like, oh wow, okay, like there's different cultures at different times have used the same materials, and that in a small way kind of brings us together a little bit. I think there's lots of reasons, but Pam, go ahead. Pam, go ahead.
Yeah, I think yeah, it's like it's the relationship building, but I think it's also the customization. And um I think we are in a time that we're also kind of fed up of relying on systems and supply chains, that the idea that you can um create something from scratch on your own is really appealing. And this is the reason why a lot of people have community gardens, why a lot of people are upcycling. It's just like we're kind of tired of like our hobbies and our lives being dependent on like a system. So it's kind of like a way to break away from that system, I think. And I think that's why it makes it really appealing, because then you are kind of in control of like your own supply. And like I said, it's just like you spend more time with each step of production. You get to understand it a little bit better. And I think it's great that more people are doing that. I think it's really like, this idea of having a deeper connection with the materials that you use, and breaking away from the systems that kind of control what kind of art you make. That it's really appealing to start everything from scratch.
Great answers. Thanks so much.
There's a question from Julie Hollenbach in the chat. It says, "Thanks so much, Pam and Nam. I love listening to both of you talk about your practices and describe your work. I wonder, is it possible to see examples of your work? We didn't ask you to prepare anything, but are you in a room where we might see something? Nam, I think I see some paintings behind you. Is there any chance we could
Sure.
take a look?
We can go on a Zoom tour.
Yeah. It's always so
Um,
funny to be like moving with it. Oh wow, beautiful.
is that? Yeah, can you see that? Yeah, it's good,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So the purple part is gesso,
Hmm.
it's like infused with pigment, and then the blue part's uh, oil. Let's see what else I can show here. There's there's one. So it was a kind of creating some sort of optical effect on the computer. But
Mm.
so I'm really excited about the black because I learned how to modify the gesso to make it very extra matte without having to. So just with one layer, I can make it super matte, and that creates a kind of depth space that really pops out. This is just like a sanded surface. So, but it somehow has like a kind of forward presence, but being in the background, it's kind of has somehow like pops off. So if you can, if that makes sense. Sorry, I
Yeah,
just
yeah.
um,
Sarah had another question, Nam, asking about how you make the gesso. RSG in plaster or plastic based?
so I have a recipe that I got from the company that I source my materials from. The recipe is a a gelatin binder, which you can which you buy from them, and this is like a chemically produced gelatin that is more stable than rabbit skin glue. And then and it's pretty much that plus the minerals, and that the minerals can be anything from alabaster to marble dust to talcum, depending on what you want from the property of the mineral, in different ratios. I'm experimenting with that right now. Uh, I can tell you that some they all do kind of a little bit different things. Um, and then you take the pigment and you mix it with an acrylic, and the acrylic is really not acting as like the main binder. It's really just to kind of like hold the pigment in a fluid state, and then you mix it all together. So right now I've been working on um, organizing a system where I have the have it divided a little bit, where I premix the gelatin based mineral medium on one side, and then I have the acrylic color in another squeeze tube, and then I can kind of just mix as I go. I call it the stir fry method because it's very much like stir fry, where you have to like prepare all the ingredients and you put it all together. And the benefit of that is that you waste much less material.
What about you? Is there any work where you are, or can you point us to anywhere where we might be able to see it?
So I'm not in my studio. I'm at home. So I don't have any work here with me to show you. But I will have, if you're in Nova Scotia, I will have there's a group show for the Visual Arts Nova Scotia mentorship program that I'm currently doing at early July, at the Craig Gallery, and I will be showing my survey of cochineal in that show if you want to check it out.
Oh, exciting. Thank you. All right. Any other final questions?
For Pam,
Oh, yeah.
actually.
Go for it.
So I was really interested in your project. Is it in process, and do you write about it, or would it be presented online somewhere where I could?
I'm not writing about it, but I'm thinking of how to document it beyond the final object that I'm working on. Um, I'm happy to talk to you about it. Yeah, I will. I'm still kind of deciding. I'm in the process of figuring out how to take a craft that is heavily about processes, and how to show it to the viewer, so that they understand what's going on without kind of making it like a diorama sort of situation. So I will be writing about it. Currently I'm just in the testing and making period, but there will be a compilation one day. But I work really slow, so one day might be in a couple of years. But you're welcome to contact me anytime and ask me about the colors that I'm creating. Yeah.
Okay.
I actually also had a question for you, Nam, because when you were talking about the mineral additives that you add to your paints, you mentioned a lot of them that are currently, so talc, for example, the sources are not reliable, just because of like the use and, you know, like mining shortages. Um, how do you deal with like, do you have like a set resource and like the amounts that you're using are not significant that you need to panic about getting the same um amount of material, or like do you find that you have to go back and change your recipes just because of the changes of the natural resources that you're using?
So far, I don't know. I'd have to take a look at the company, like where they source everything. From for the most part, most of it is like waste product from marble mining or different things like that. These industries have existed for a very, very, very long time, throughout Europe. So I haven't had any issues with sourcing, but I also am very aware that like anything else in the world, like these are not unlimited resources, and that they do come from human extraction. So yeah, I mean, like that's just part of the process of being in our system. But yeah, I haven't had any issues so far. But I and knock on wood, but I wouldn't doubt that that could be a problem for me in the future, like and as well as for everybody else with securing materials.
Is there anywhere people in Berlin might be able to see your work, or elsewhere in the next little while?
Well, yeah. So it's coming up. I have a show at the Art Gallery of Grand Prairie in
Oh, great.
2025. Um, so I mean that's in Grand Prairie, and if you know where that is, it's far, far away. But if you are in the neighborhood of Northern Alberta, um, you could check it out. It's going to be with a local artist named Lionel Allingham, and it's being curated by Jessica Groom, who's also an artist who was based in Berlin for about more than 10 years. And we collaborated a lot together, and she wanted to bring my work to the attention of that audience. Also because the work that she chose is a response to the space of the sky growing up in Edmonton in this kind of northern Alberta region. And the colors are influenced by those experiences. And the same is very actually stunningly similar to Lionel, who is a much older artist who was working in Grand Prairie, I believe in the 60s, 70s, 80s, up until this day. Yeah, so it's going to be an exciting opportunity to show a lot of work. So
Amazing. Okay, so Grand Prairie people, go check out Nam's work in 2025.
yeah,
And Nova Scotia friends, go see Pam's show July 3rd to 28th at the Craig Gallery. Yeah, and thank you both so much. It was such a pleasure to talk to both of you.